Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Sleepy Crime Stories. I know many of you enjoy drifting off to sleep with these stories playing softly in the background, and I'm so glad you're here tonight. Before you settle in, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from. And if you enjoy what you hear, please consider liking and subscribing. It truly helps this channel grow. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something important. The stories we share here involve real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims, to honor their lives, and perhaps to help others recognize the warning signs that might prevent similar heartbreak. Every name you hear tonight belonged to someone who was loved, who mattered, who deserved so much more than the fate that found them. Tonight's episode is called When the One You Trust Becomes the One You Fear. We'll be exploring 4 cases where the person closest to the victim, a husband, a partner, a soulmate, turned out to be the very source of danger that no one saw coming. These stories span 2 decades and stretch across the American landscape, from the sun-drenched valleys of California to the quiet suburbs of Colorado, from the oak-lined streets of North Carolina to the mountain towns tucked high in the Rockies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume just a little. Let the words wash over you like a gentle stream. Get comfortable, dim the lights, pull up the blankets, and let's begin. Story 1, Lacey Peterson. Our first story takes us to Modesto, California, a city that sits in the heart of the San Joaquin Valley, where the flatlands stretch endlessly toward the horizon and the summer heat shimmers above the pavement like a living thing. Modesto is the kind of place where sprinklers hiss in the early morning, where families gather for barbecues on tree-shaded patios, and where the pace of life moves just a little slower than the big cities that bookend the valley. San Francisco to the west, Sacramento to the north. The name Modesto itself comes from the Spanish word for modest, and indeed, there is a modesty to this city, a quiet pride in its simplicity. The downtown streets are lined with old brick buildings that have stood for generations, their facades telling stories of a time when the valley was the agricultural heart of the nation. Fig orchards once blanketed the surrounding countryside, and the scent of almonds still drifts on the warm breeze each spring when the trees burst into clouds of white blossoms. If you drive through Modesto in the late afternoon, when the sun hangs low and golden over the valley floor, you can see why people put down roots here. The neighborhoods are older, established, with mature trees that arch over the streets, creating tunnels of dappled shade. Children ride bicycles along cracked sidewalks. Dogs sleep on porches. The air carries the faint sweetness of fruit from the orchards that still dot the outskirts of town. A reminder that this is still farm country, still a place where things grow. It was in this unassuming city that a young couple had built what appeared from the outside to be the beginning of a beautiful life together. Their names were Scott and Lacey Peterson, and in the autumn of 2002, they seemed to have everything a young couple could wish for. Lacey Denise Rocha was born on May the 4th, 1975. From the very beginning, she was the kind of person who filled a room with warmth simply by walking into it. Those who knew her as a child remember a girl with an infectious laugh and an energy that seemed boundless. She grew up in Modesto, the daughter of Sharon Rocha and Dennis Rocha, though her parents divorced when she was young. Her mother later remarried, and Lacey gained a stepfather, Ron Gransky, who became a steady, loving presence in her life. As a young woman, Lacey attended California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, where she studied ornamental horticulture. There was something fitting about this choice. Lacey had always been drawn to beauty, to growing things, to nurturing life. She was the kind of woman who could transform a bare patch of earth into a garden, who could turn a simple dinner into an event, who could make anyone feel welcome in her home. It was during her college years that Lacey met Scott Lee Peterson. Scott was tall, handsome in a conventional way, with dark hair and a smile that came easily. He was studying agricultural business, and on the surface they seemed perfectly matched. Two young Californians with an appreciation for the land and a vision of a comfortable, prosperous future. They married on August 9th, 1997, in a ceremony that friends and family would remember as joyful and full of promise. The wedding photographs show a couple that seemed genuinely happy, Lacey radiant in her gown, Scott tall and attentive beside her. They looked like the kind of couple you might see on the cover of a wedding magazine, the kind whose future stretches out before them like an open road with nothing but blue sky ahead. The couple settled in the San Luis Obispo area initially, enjoying the coastal lifestyle, the fog-kissed mornings and golden afternoons that make California's Central Coast one of the most beautiful places in the world. But eventually, the pull of family drew them back to Modesto, where Lacey had deep roots and where her mother, her sister, and the community she loved could be close at hand. In October of 2000, Scott and Lacey purchased a charming 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom bungalow on Covina Avenue. The house sat in an upscale neighborhood near East La Loma Park, a tree-lined area where children played on the sidewalks and neighbors waved to one another across neatly trimmed lawns. The house cost them $177,000, a modest sum, even then, that spoke to the accessible charm of Modesto real estate. Lacey threw herself into making their house a home. She was, by all accounts, devoted to the art of domesticity in the most genuine and enthusiastic way. She cooked elaborate meals, hosted dinner parties for friends and family, and spent hours watching Martha Stewart, absorbing ideas for how to make every corner of their home more inviting, more beautiful, more alive. Scott, meanwhile, had taken a position with Trade Corp USA, a newly established branch of a European fertilizer company. He earned roughly $5,000 a month before taxes, a decent salary for the area, though not extravagant. He traveled for work, covering territory across the valley, and Lacey sometimes accompanied him on trips, turning business travel into mini adventures for the two of them. And then, in the spring of 2002, came the news that seemed to complete the picture of their idyllic life. Lacey was pregnant. The baby was due on February the 10th, 2003, and the couple had already chosen a name for their son, Connor. The nursery was being prepared, the baby clothes were being washed and folded, and the house on Covina Avenue hummed with the quiet anticipation that comes before a first child enters the world. But beneath this carefully curated surface, something was shifting. Something dark and silent was taking root, the way a crack forms in a foundation. Invisible at first, but spreading steadily, threatening to bring everything crashing down. In November of 2002, just weeks before Christmas, Scott Peterson was introduced by a friend to a woman named Amber Frey. Amber was a 27-year-old massage therapist living in Fresno, about 90 miles southeast of Modesto. She was a single mother, attractive and warm, and she was looking for a genuine connection. Scott told Amber that he was single, but he went further than that. In early December, around the time the couple attended a holiday party together and were photographed looking close and comfortable, Scott told Amber something extraordinary. He told her that he had lost his wife, that this would be his first Christmas alone. He spoke of his deceased spouse with what appeared to be genuine grief. Think about that for a moment. Let it settle. While his very much alive wife was at home, 8 months pregnant with their son, decorating the nursery, planning Christmas dinner, feeling the baby kick, Scott Peterson was telling another woman that his wife was dead. Whether this was a calculated confession of premeditation or simply a convenient lie to maintain an affair, it would later haunt the case like a ghost that refused to be quiet. Dying the 23rd of December 2002 was a Monday. It was the day before Christmas Eve, and the Peterson household was alive with holiday preparations. That evening, around 5:45 in the afternoon, Scott and Lacey drove to Salon Salon, the hair salon where Lacey's sister, Amy Rocha, worked. Amy gave Scott a haircut while showing Lacey how to style her hair with a straightening iron, a small, intimate family moment, the kind that forms the tapestry of everyday life. Amy later recalled that the couple seemed normal. Scott mentioned plans to go golfing the next morning and offered to pick up a gift basket from a local shop called Vela Farms for their father. Lacey was wearing tan pants and a black blouse with small flowers. They picked up pizza from Mountain Mike's on the way home, ate dinner, and watched Monday Night Football. At around 8:30, Lacey spoke with her mother, Sharon, to confirm their plans for Christmas Eve dinner at Sharon's house the following evening. It was the last time Sharon Rocha would hear her daughter's voice. The morning of December the 24th, 2002, Christmas Eve, dawned cool and overcast in Modesto. According to Scott, he and Lacey had a quiet morning together. He would later tell investigators that Lacey was watching a cooking show, that she mentioned plans to walk the dog, go to the grocery store, and make gingerbread for their Christmas brunch. At 8:40 in the morning, someone logged onto the computer in the spare bedroom of the Peterson home. They accessed the MSN homepage, a weather site, and 2 shopping pages on Yahoo, one for a red Gap scarf and another for a sunflower umbrella stand. The session lasted about 5 minutes. Investigators believe this was Lacey, browsing casually while Scott showered. It would be one of the last digital traces of Lacey Peterson alive. What happened next depends entirely on whom you choose to believe. Scott Peterson told investigators that after getting dressed, he went to his company warehouse, which was nearby, sent some emails, and loaded his 14-foot aluminum boat onto a trailer. He then drove approximately 90 miles to the Berkeley Marina on the San Francisco Bay, where he spent about an hour and a half fishing. He said he tried calling Lacey on both the home phone and her cell phone during his drive home, but could not reach her. He arrived back at the house around 4:30 in the afternoon, washed his clothes, ate some leftover pizza, and then called his mother-in-law to ask if Lacey was with her. That phone call, that single, seemingly innocuous phone call, was the moment everything began to unravel. Sharon Rocha did not have Lacey. She had not seen Lacey. She had not heard from Lacey since the night before. Alarm spread through the family like wildfire through dry grass. Scott and Lacey's stepfather both reported Lacey missing to the Modesto Police Department. The report was received shortly before 6 in the evening on Christmas Eve. Meanwhile, a neighbor had already discovered something troubling earlier in the day. The Petersons' golden retriever, Mackenzie, had been found wandering the neighborhood alone, still wearing his leash. The leash was muddy, as if the dog had been out for some time. The neighbor had put the dog back in the Petersons' yard with a note on the door. When police arrived at the Peterson home, they found no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared to be missing. Lacey's purse was still in the house, her car keys inside it. Her car, complete with the girls' car seats, ready for the baby, was parked in the garage. Everything suggested that Lacey Peterson had simply walked out the door and never come back. Detective Alan Burkini was called to the scene that evening. He was a seasoned investigator, and as he walked through the quiet house on Covina Avenue, certain details caught his trained eye. There were wet towels sitting on top of the washing machine. Scott explained he had taken them out to wash his clothes from the fishing trip. The explanation was reasonable enough, but Burkini filed it away, the way good detectives file away everything, even the things that seem to mean nothing at all. See, the days that followed Lacey's disappearance transformed Modesto from a quiet valley city into the epicenter of a national news event. The story had everything that the media ecosystem craves: a beautiful, pregnant woman, a handsome husband, the Christmas holiday backdrop, and a mystery that deepened with each passing hour. The timing of the disappearance added a particular poignancy. Christmas is supposed to be a time of gathering, of warmth, of family drawing close together against the cold. Instead, the Peterson house on Covina Avenue became a command center for a desperate search, and the holiday decorations that still adorned the neighborhood took on an almost unbearable sadness. Twinkling lights and cheerful wreaths standing in silent contrast to the horror that was unfolding. Volunteers flooded the city from across the region, church groups, civic organizations, strangers who had seen Lacey's face on the news and felt compelled to help. They all came, forming search parties that spread out across the parks, the vacant lots, the irrigation ditches and fields surrounding Modesto. The sound of their voices calling Lacey's name carried across the flat valley floor, echoing through the winter stillness like a prayer that no one was sure would be answered. Yellow ribbons appeared on trees and lampposts throughout the city, a silent, collective prayer for Lacey's safe return. Her face stared out from flyers taped to storefront windows, stapled to telephone poles, handed to passing motorists. That familiar smile, warm, open, full of life, became the symbol of a community's anguish and a nation's growing obsession. Scott Peterson, meanwhile, presented a complicated picture to the watching world. He participated in the search efforts, but those around him noticed something. He seemed composed. Too composed, perhaps, for a man whose pregnant wife had vanished without a trace on Christmas Eve. He answered questions from police and reporters, but there was a flatness to his affect, a studied calm that struck some observers as either admirable stoicism or troubling detachment. On New Year's Eve, the city of Modesto held a public vigil for Lacey and baby Connor. Hundreds of people gathered in the park near the Peterson home, their candles flickering in the cold December air, their faces drawn with worry and grief. The temperature had dropped as evening fell, and breath hung in small clouds before the mourners, mixing with the thin tendrils of candle smoke that drifted upward into the dark sky. Children clutched their parents' hands. Elderly women wept openly. There was a unity in the grief, a sense that something terrible had happened to one of their own, and that the community would not rest until answers were found. Scott Peterson was there, standing among the mourners, but he declined to speak. When cameras found him, photographers captured two moments that would haunt his eventual trial. In one, he was bending down with his niece to place a candle, a broad smile on his face, as if he were at a birthday party rather than a vigil for his missing wife. In another, he stood among a group, his head thrown back in laughter, the sound carrying across the cold night air. For a man whose pregnant wife had been missing for a week, this behavior struck many observers as deeply, profoundly wrong. There is, of course, no correct way to grieve. People process loss and fear in different ways, and sometimes laughter is a defense mechanism, a way of holding back the flood. But in the court of public opinion, which had been cautiously neutral, the scales began to tilt. And then there was the phone call. What the public did not know, what would not emerge for weeks, was that during the vigil for his missing wife and unborn son, Scott Peterson had stepped away to call Amber Frey. The woman he had told his wife was dead, the woman who, at that very moment, still believed she was dating a grieving widower. But Amber Frey had begun to have doubts. On December the 30th, 6 days after Lacey vanished, Amber saw a newspaper article about the missing Modesto woman. She recognized the husband in the photograph, the man she had been seeing, the man who had told her his wife was dead. Amber did something extraordinary. She called the Modesto police tip line and immediately offered her full cooperation. She agreed to record her future phone conversations with Scott, creating a remarkable archive of audio evidence that would later play a devastating role in the trial. On January the 24th, 2003, Amber Frey stood before a crush of television cameras and microphones and told the world about her relationship with Scott Peterson. She appeared with her attorney, the formidable Gloria Allred, and her composure in that moment was remarkable. She admitted to the affair. She confirmed that Scott had told her he was single, and she made it clear that she was cooperating fully with law enforcement. The revelation of the affair transformed the case. The media, already captivated, went into overdrive. Scott Peterson became the most scrutinized man in America, his every movement tracked by cameras and investigators alike. The Modesto police, now deeply suspicious of Scott, obtained warrants to place surveillance cameras near the Peterson home and GPS tracking devices on his vehicles. What they observed was a man who seemed remarkably unbothered by his wife's disappearance. He rented a series of different cars and trucks, changing vehicles every few days. He traveled frequently. He continued his relationship with Amber. though the conversations, now being recorded, revealed a man weaving ever more elaborate lies. In one recorded call, Scott told Amber he was traveling in Europe, describing the sights and sounds of Paris, while in reality, he was in Modesto, attending a vigil for his missing wife. The audacity of the lie was breathtaking. Here was a man watching candlelight flicker for his vanished pregnant wife while whispering descriptions of the Eiffel Tower to his girlfriend on the phone. Then winter turned to spring. The rains came and went, soaking the valley and turning the creeks into rushing brown torrents before retreating again, leaving behind a landscape softened by new green growth. The almond trees bloomed, their white petals drifting like snow across the orchards. In any other year, it would have been beautiful. But for those who loved Lacey Peterson, the changing seasons were simply a cruel reminder of how much time had passed, how many days had elapsed without answers. The search for Lacey continued, but hope was dimming like a candle burning down to its last inch of wick. The police investigation had shifted from a missing persons case to something far more ominous. In March, authorities officially reclassified the case as a homicide. The word hit the community like a physical blow. Homicide. It meant that somewhere, someone in authority had concluded that Lassie was not coming home alive. And then, on April the 13th, 2003, a Sunday, a grim discovery was made along the eastern shore of San Francisco Bay. The weather had been turbulent in recent weeks, with strong storms churning the bay's waters and reshaping its shoreline. A man walking his dog near the Point Isabel regional shoreline in the city of Richmond noticed something in the rocks and debris at the water's edge. What he found were the badly decomposed remains of a fetus. The next day, about a mile to the south, the remains of a woman washed ashore near Point Isabel. The body was severely decomposed. The head, forearms, and lower legs were missing, a detail that investigators attributed to the prolonged exposure to the bay's powerful tidal currents, the salt water, and the marine life that inhabits those dark, cold depths. It was a grim end for a woman who had spent her life nurturing beauty, for a baby who had never drawn his first breath. DNA testing confirmed what many had feared. The remains were those of Lacey Peterson and her unborn son, Connor. The bodies had surfaced just a few miles from the Berkeley Marina, the exact location where Scott Peterson said he had been fishing on December the 24th. The same day the identification was confirmed, April the 18th, 2003, Scott Peterson was arrested. He was found not in Modesto, not at home grieving, but in La Jolla, a wealthy coastal neighborhood near San Diego, about 30 miles from the Mexican border. When police apprehended him, they found a man who looked nothing like the clean-cut husband who had stood before cameras pleading for his wife's return. He had dyed his hair a sandy blonde and grown a goatee. He was carrying nearly $15,000 in cash, his brother's identification card, multiple cell phones, camping equipment, and a number of other items that suggested preparation for an extended trip or a permanent disappearance. His car, purchased under his mother's name, contained maps, clothing, and survival gear. To investigators and to the watching public, this looked unmistakably like a man preparing to flee the country. The Mexican border was a short drive away, and freedom, such as it is for a man running from murder, lay just beyond it. Scott Peterson was charged with 2 counts of murder: first-degree murder for the death of Lacey and second-degree murder for the death of Connor. He pleaded not guilty, and the wheels of the American justice system began their slow, deliberate turn. The trial that followed was one of the most watched legal proceedings in American history. It lasted nearly 6 months, and every day brought new revelations, new testimony, and new reasons for the nation to remain glued to their screens. The case was moved from Stanislaus County to San Mateo County, over 90 miles away, because the intense media coverage in Modesto made a fair trial there impossible. Judge Alfred DeLucchi presided over the proceedings, and the courtroom became a stage where 2 very different stories of Scott Peterson would be told. The prosecution, led by Rick DiStazo, painted a picture of a man who wanted freedom from his marriage, freedom from the responsibility of fatherhood, freedom to pursue his relationship with Amber Frey without the complications of a wife and child. They argued that Scott had killed Lacey sometime between the evening of December the 23rd and the morning of December the 24th, placed her body in his boat, driven to the Berkeley Marina, and dumped her in the San Francisco Bay. The prosecution acknowledged a fundamental challenge. They had no crime scene, no murder weapon, and no witnesses to the killing. The case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence, but the circumstances, they argued, were overwhelming. There was the affair with Amber Frey. There were the lies, the constant, elaborate, unnecessary lies. There was the fishing trip to the very body of water where Lacey's remains would surface months later. There was the freshly purchased boat that few people knew about. There was the behavior after the disappearance, the rented cars, the dyed hair, the cash, the brother's ID, and there were the recorded phone calls, hours upon hours of Scott Peterson constructing an alternate reality for Amber while the real world searched desperately for his wife. The defense, led by the prominent attorney Mark Garagos, offered a different narrative. They argued that Scott Peterson was a cheating husband, yes, but not a murderer. They suggested that Lacey had been abducted, possibly by individuals involved in a nearby burglary that occurred around the time of her disappearance. They pointed to witness sightings of a pregnant woman matching Lacey's description, walking in the neighborhood on the morning of the 24th, suggesting she was alive after Scott had left for his fishing trip. The defense also questioned the physical evidence, arguing that it would have been nearly impossible for Scott to transport Lacey's body in the small boat without capsizing it. They even conducted a demonstration with a weighted dummy to illustrate this point, a demonstration that ended with the boat sinking, which, depending on your perspective, either proved the defense's point or demonstrated nothing at all. Amber Frey's testimony was among the most powerful moments of the trial. She sat on the witness stand with quiet dignity and recounted her relationship with Scott Peterson, including the devastating moment when he told her, before Lacey's disappearance, that his wife was already dead. The jury listened to recording after recording of Scott's phone calls, his voice smooth, his lies effortless, his ability to inhabit a fictional version of his life seemingly limitless. Perhaps the most haunting moment came when the jury heard a voicemail Scott had left for Lacey on December the 24th as he drove home from the Berkeley Marina. His voice was casual, affectionate, ordinary. "Hey, beautiful," he said. It was the voice of a man calling his wife, or the performance of a man who already knew she would never hear it. On November the 12th, 2004, after nearly 7 days of deliberation, 7 days in which the nation held its breath, in which television cameras remained fixed on the courthouse doors, in which commentators and legal analysts filled the airwaves with speculation and analysis, the jury returned its verdict. The courtroom fell silent, the kind of silence that has weight, that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. The foreman read the decision. Scott Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Lacey and second-degree murder for the death of Connor. The reaction inside the courtroom was immediate. Sharon Rocha collapsed into sobs. Outside the courthouse, a crowd that had gathered erupted into cheers, a spontaneous, visceral response that reflected the deep emotional investment the public had made in this case. For nearly 2 years, Lacey Peterson's face had been seared into the national consciousness, and now, finally, there was some measure of accountability. The penalty phase followed, and the jury recommended death. Judge DeLucchi agreed, sentencing Scott Peterson to death by lethal injection. As the sentence was pronounced, Scott Peterson stood motionless, his face revealing nothing. Whatever storms raged within him, if any raged at all, remained hidden behind that same smooth, impenetrable surface that had characterized his demeanor from the very beginning. But the story of Scott Peterson did not end with that sentence. The legal system, with its layers of appeals and reviews, continued to churn. In 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned Peterson's death sentence, though his murder convictions were upheld. The court found that serious errors had been made during jury selection that compromised his right to an impartial jury at the penalty phase. In December of 2021, Peterson was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And then, in early 2024, the Los Angeles Innocence Project announced that it was representing Scott Peterson, investigating what it described as his claim of actual innocence. New evidence, they said, had come to light. The case, it seemed, was not yet finished writing its final chapter. The announcement sent shockwaves through the true crime community and reopened wounds that many had thought were beginning, however slowly, to heal. For the Rocha family, for Sharon and Ron and Amy and all who loved Lacey, the decades since that Christmas Eve have been an unending exercise in grief. They have attended hearings, listened to appeals, faced cameras, and endured the peculiar torture of having their most private pain become the nation's most public spectacle. Each new legal development drags them back to that December morning, back to the phone call that changed everything, back to the moment when the world they knew crumbled to dust. Sharon Rocha, Lacey's mother, has spoken publicly about the toll the case has taken on her family. She has described the sleepless nights, the anniversaries that feel like open wounds, the birthdays that Lassie will never celebrate, the milestones that Connor will never reach. She has spoken of the grandson she will never hold, the first steps she will never witness, the graduation cap she will never see thrown into the air. But through it all, the Rocha family has never let Lassie become just a name in a case file, just a face on a missing poster, just a chapter in a true crime podcast. They have spoken of her warmth, her laughter, the way she could light up a room with nothing more than her presence. They have ensured that the world remembers not just how Lacey Peterson died, but how she lived, fully, joyfully, with her whole heart open to the world. And so, as we close this first chapter of tonight's journey, let us hold that thought gently, like a candle flame cupped in our hands against the wind. Lacey Denise Peterson was 27 years old. She was going to be a mother. She loved cooking and gardening and making her home beautiful. She watched Martha Stewart and dreamed of perfect dinner parties. She had a laugh that could fill a room and a smile that could warm you on the coldest day. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. And on a cool December morning in Modesto, California, in a house decorated for Christmas, in a neighborhood where the sprinklers hissed and the dogs barked and the children played on the sidewalks, she walked out of her house and into history, leaving behind a question that still echoes through the San Joaquin Valley. What really happened on Christmas Eve? Take a deep breath. Let the tension ease from your shoulders. We have 3 more stories to explore tonight, but there is no rush. The night is long, and the stories will wait for you. When we return, we'll travel to the suburbs of Frederick, Colorado, where a seemingly perfect family hid a darkness that no one could have imagined. But first, let the quiet settle around you. Feel the weight of the blankets. Notice the rhythm of your breathing. And when you're ready, we'll continue. Story 2, The Man Behind the Smile, Chris Watts. Story 2, Chris Watts. Welcome back. I hope you're still comfortable, still settled in. If you've been drifting, that's perfectly fine. Let the words come to you like waves on a shore, soft and steady and unhurried. There's no need to follow every detail. Just let the story carry you. Our second story tonight takes us to Colorado, to the flat, windswept plains that stretch east of the Rocky Mountains. If you've ever driven north from Denver along Interstate 25, you'll know this landscape, the way the suburbs give way to open prairie, the way the mountains hover on the western horizon like a promise, their peaks dusted white even in summer. The sky here is enormous, an unbroken dome of blue that seems to stretch from one edge of the earth to the other. It's in this landscape, about 30 miles north of Denver, that you'll find the town of Frederick, Colorado. Frederick is one of those communities that has grown rapidly in recent decades, transforming from a small agricultural outpost into a sprawling suburb where new housing developments spread across the prairie like puzzle pieces being laid one by one. The streets have names that evoke a kind of aspirational Americana: Saratoga Trail, Stoneham Park, Prairie Center Circle, and the houses are the kind that young families dream about: spacious, modern, with 2-car garages and tidy lawns that gleam green against the golden brown of the surrounding grasslands. There is a sameness to these neighborhoods that can be both comforting and disorienting. The houses share similar floor plans, similar color palettes, similar landscaping. The streets curve gently, looping back on themselves in cul-de-sacs where children ride scooters and families walk their dogs in the evening light. On summer nights, when the sun sets late and paints the sky in shades of peach and lavender, you can hear the murmur of conversation from backyard patios, the distant bark of a dog, the rhythmic click of sprinkler heads turning in the darkness. It is the kind of place where terrible things are not supposed to happen, where the biggest dramas are supposed to involve homeowners, association disputes, and parking violations, and whose turn it is to host the neighborhood barbecue. Frederick, Colorado, was built for quiet, comfortable lives. It was not built for what was about to occur at 2825 Saratoga Trail. In 2013, a young couple from North Carolina purchased one of these homes. It was a 5-bedroom house at 2825 Saratoga Trail, and it cost them just under $400,000. The couple's names were Christopher and Shanann Watts, and from the outside, from every conceivable angle, they appeared to be living the American dream. Chris Watts was born on May the 16th, 1985, in Spring Lake, North Carolina. He grew up as a quiet, somewhat unremarkable boy, the kind of kid who doesn't cause trouble but doesn't particularly stand out either. Those who knew him in his youth would later describe him as easygoing, agreeable, the type of person who went along with whatever was happening without making waves. He was pleasant. He was polite. He was, in the most unsettling sense of the word, forgettable. Shanann Catherine Razuchek was born on January the 10th, 1984, in Aberdeen, North Carolina, a small town about an hour south of Raleigh. Unlike Chris, Shanann was anything but forgettable. She was vivacious, driven, and fiercely social. The kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately became its center of gravity. She had a gift for connection, for making people feel seen and valued, and she would later channel that gift into a career that was as much about personality as it was about product. Chris and Shanann met in 2010 and married on November the 3rd, 2012, in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. By all accounts, the early years of their marriage were happy, or at least appeared so. They moved to Colorado for a fresh start, drawn by the promise of good jobs and affordable housing in the booming Denver suburbs. Chris found work with Anadarko Petroleum, one of the largest oil and gas companies operating in the Denver-Julesburg Basin. He worked as a field operator, spending his days driving between remote oil well sites scattered across the plains northeast of Denver, checking equipment, monitoring production levels, and performing routine maintenance. It was physical, outdoor work, and Chris seemed to thrive in it. The solitude of the oil fields suited his quiet nature. Shanann, meanwhile, had found her calling in the world of multi-level marketing. She became a sales representative for Lavelle, a company that sold a line of health and wellness products called Thrive. The products included nutritional supplements, patches, and shakes, and Shanann promoted them with the enthusiasm and skill of a born saleswoman. Her social media presence was prolific. She posted constantly to Facebook, sharing videos of her family, testimonials about the products, and glimpses into what appeared to be a picture-perfect life. And in many ways, the life she presented was genuinely enviable. The house on Saratoga Trail was beautiful, spacious rooms filled with natural light, a manicured backyard where the girls played on warm afternoons, a kitchen that was always stocked and always clean. The children, Bella Marie, born in December of 2013, and Celeste Catherine, known as Cece, born in July of 2015, were adorable and photogenic, with their mother's bright eyes and their father's easy smile. Chris appeared in Shanann's posts as the devoted husband and father, smiling beside his girls, helping with dinner, posing for family portraits that radiated warmth and togetherness. In Shanann's videos, he was quiet and agreeable, playing the supporting role to her starring turn with what seemed like genuine contentment. He changed diapers. He read bedtime stories. He held his wife's hand. The image was so consistent, so polished, so complete that it would have taken extraordinary perception to see through it. Social media, of course, is a stage. We all curate our lives to some degree, choosing which moments to share and which to hide. But Shanann's curation was particularly thorough. Her online presence was not just a hobby, it was her livelihood. The Thrive business depended on her projecting an image of success, of health, of happiness. Every post was both a genuine expression and a calculated advertisement, and the line between the two had become so blurred that even Shanann herself may not have known where her real life ended and her brand began. But behind the curated images, the filters and the hashtags and the carefully worded captions, the reality was more complicated. In 2015, the Watts family had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy, declaring liabilities of nearly $450,000 against a combined income of roughly $100,000. The 5-bedroom house, the 2 cars, the lifestyle that Shanann showcased online, all of it was built on a foundation that was far shakier than anyone knew. Financial stress, of course, does not make someone a murderer. Millions of families face debt and hardship without resorting to violence. But it is a pressure, a constant grinding weight that can erode a relationship from within, the way water erodes stone, slowly, invisibly, until one day the structure gives way entirely. In the summer of 2018, something shifted in Chris Watts. Those who knew him noticed it, though they couldn't quite name it. He became more distant, more distracted. He started working out obsessively, transforming his body with a dedication that seemed to come from nowhere. He changed his diet, lost weight, gained muscle. He seemed, in some indefinable way, to be becoming a different person, shedding the old Chris like a skin that no longer fit. The reason for this transformation had a name: Nicole Kessinger. She was a co-worker at Anadarko, an environmental specialist who had been assigned to work with Chris on a project. Their relationship began sometime in June or July of 2018, and by August, it had become a full-blown affair. Nicole would later tell investigators that she believed Chris was in the process of separating from his wife. She said he told her that the marriage was essentially over, that they were selling the house, that the divorce was underway. None of this was true. Shanann, meanwhile, was dealing with her own struggles that summer. The marriage had been under strain for months, a slow deterioration that she could feel but couldn't quite diagnose. She confided in friends that Chris had become emotionally distant, that conversations that once flowed easily now felt forced and hollow. He no longer reached for her hand. He no longer looked at her the way he used to. The small, unconscious gestures of intimacy that sustain a marriage. A touch on the shoulder, a lingering glance, a spontaneous kiss, had evaporated, leaving behind a void that Shanann tried desperately to fill. She sent loving text messages that went unanswered or received only terse, perfunctory replies. She planned date nights that Chris seemed to endure rather than enjoy. She suggested couples therapy, reaching for professional help the way a drowning person reaches for a lifeline. In one heartbreaking message to a friend, she wrote that she felt like she was losing him, that the man she married was disappearing before her eyes, replaced by a stranger who wore his face but lacked his warmth. Those messages, preserved on her phone and later entered into evidence, paint a portrait of a woman fighting for her marriage with everything she had, even as the man on the other side of that marriage was already gone. Not physically, not yet, but emotionally, irrevocably. And through all of this, through the loneliness and the confusion and the slowly dawning fear that something was fundamentally wrong, Shanann was carrying new life inside her. She was pregnant with their third child, a boy they had planned to name Nico Lee Watts. She was 15 weeks along, past the fragile first trimester, into the stage where you start to feel the baby move, where the pregnancy begins to feel real and solid and permanent. In early August, Shanann left for a work trip to Arizona with her Lavelle team. It was a conference, the kind of event she loved. Energetic, social, full of the connections and affirmations that fueled her personality. She was gone for several days, and during her absence, Chris and Nicole Kessinger spent significant time together, deepening a relationship that was hurtling toward a terrible conclusion. Shanann flew home late on the night of August the 12th, 2018. Her flight from Phoenix landed in Denver after midnight, and her friend and Lavelle colleague, Nicole Atkinson, drove her home from the airport. Nicole later recalled that Shanann seemed tired, but in good spirits. They chatted during the drive about work, about the kids, about the pregnancy. Nicole dropped Shanann off at the house on Saratoga Trail at approximately 1:48 in the morning on August the 13th. Security cameras in the area captured Shanann walking to her front door, her suitcase rolling behind her, the porch light casting a soft glow around her silhouette. She entered the house. The door closed behind her. It was the last time anyone outside that house would see Shanann Watts alive. That's what happened inside 2825 Saratoga Trail in the pre-dawn hours of August the 13th has been described by Chris Watts himself, though his accounts have changed multiple times, each version more disturbing than the last. The truth, or something approaching it, would not emerge for months, and even then, there are those who believe he has never told the full story. Here is what is known. At some point after Shanann entered the house, Chris Watts killed her. He would later confess that he strangled her, wrapping his hands around her neck as she lay in their bed, squeezing until the life left her body. She was 34 years old. She was 15 weeks pregnant with a son who would never draw his first breath. What happened to the children is more difficult to establish with certainty. In his initial account to police, Chris claimed that Shanann had killed Bella and Celeste, and that he had killed Shanann in a rage after witnessing the murders. This story was a lie, a transparent, desperate fabrication designed to shift blame onto the woman he had just killed. Months later, in a prison interview conducted in February of 2019, Chris provided a fuller account. He said that after killing Shanann, He loaded her body into the back seat of his work truck and then placed the two girls, Bella and Celeste, into the truck as well. The girls were still alive at this point. 4-year-old Bella and 3-year-old Cece, groggy and confused in the dark early morning, were placed in the truck alongside their dead mother. Chris then drove approximately 45 minutes to a remote Anadarko oil site in Weld County, a place he knew well from his daily work. At the oil site, he buried Shanann in a shallow grave in the dirt, and then he turned to his daughters. He smothered Bella and Celeste with a blanket, one at a time, and forced their small bodies through the 8-inch openings of 2 crude oil storage tanks. The openings were barely large enough to fit a child's body. Investigators would later describe the effort required as unimaginable. Bella, the older daughter, fought back. She struggled. She tried to live. This detail, revealed during the sentencing hearing, caused even hardened investigators to weep. Nuts. Back in Frederick, the morning of August the 13th dawned warm and clear, the way most August mornings do on the Colorado plains. The sun came up over the prairie, painting the new housing developments in shades of gold, and the residents of Saratoga Trail went about their routines, commuting to work, dropping children at daycare, watering lawns, living the ordinary lives that make up the fabric of any suburb. But at the Watts house, something was wrong. Nicole Atkinson, the friend who had driven Shanann home from the airport just hours earlier, grew concerned when Shanann didn't respond to her text messages that morning. This was unusual. Shanann was almost never unreachable. She was a woman who lived on her phone, who responded to messages within minutes, who maintained a constant digital presence. When Shanann also missed an important prenatal appointment, Nicole's concern turned to alarm. She drove to the house on Saratoga Trail. She knocked on the door. There was no answer. She called Chris at work, and she called the Frederick Police Department. Officers arrived at the house, and Chris, contacted at his job site, returned home to let them in. What they found was troubling. Shanann's purse was on the counter, her car keys inside it. Her phone was found between the sofa cushions. Her lupus medication, which she needed daily and would never leave behind, was in her purse. Her car, with the children's car seat still installed, was parked in the garage. Her favorite shoes were visible through a window. Her wedding ring sat on the bedside table. Everything that Shanann would need to function in the world was still inside the house. Only Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were gone. Chris Watts stood in his living room and told the police officers that he had no idea where his family might be. He said he had last seen Shanann at 5:15 that morning when he left for work. He said Bella and Celeste had been in bed. He seemed concerned, but calm. That same calibrated composure that in these cases can read as either innocence or performance. That afternoon, Denver television stations interviewed Chris outside his house. He stood on the front porch, the neighborhood stretching out behind him in the bright August sunshine, and pleaded for the safe return of his family. He wore a blue and orange North Carolina Tar Heels shirt. His arms were crossed over his chest, a posture that body language experts would later dissect endlessly. His words were appropriate enough. He said he missed his family, that he wanted them home, that the house felt empty without them. But something about his delivery didn't sit right with the investigators watching from nearby, or with the millions who would later view the footage. There was a flatness to his affect, a disconnect between the desperate words and the calm, almost detached way he delivered them. He rocked back and forth on his feet. He looked down. He talked about his missing wife and children in the past tense. Shanann loved those girls, he said, instead of Shanann loves those girls. A small linguistic slip that to trained ears sounded like the tolling of a bell. It was the language of someone who already knew that his family was gone because he was the one who had made them gone. CBI agent. Tammy Lee watched that interview and made a decision. She needed to get Chris Watts into an interrogation room as soon as possible. His neighbor, Nathan Tranastic, offered police something invaluable: surveillance footage from a security camera mounted on his garage. The footage showed the Watts house in the early morning hours of August the 13th. It showed Chris Watts backing his truck into the garage at around 5:27 in the morning. It showed him loading something, or someone, into the bed of the truck, and it showed him driving away. What the footage did not show was anyone else leaving the house. No Shanann walking to her car. No children being led to a vehicle. The only person seen departing 2825 Saratoga Trail that morning was Chris Watts. The investigation moved with remarkable speed. On August the 14th, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation issued an endangered missing alert for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste. FBI agents joined the search. Investigators canvassed the neighborhood, knocked on doors, collected security footage from every camera within range. They pulled cell phone records, examined financial documents, and began to construct a timeline of Chris Watts's movements in the hours after Shanann arrived home. One of the first cracks in Chris's story came from an unexpected source: Nicole Kessinger. She had been following the news coverage of the Watts family's disappearance, and realizing the implications, contacted the police to disclose her relationship with Chris. She told investigators that she and Chris had been romantically involved for several weeks, that he had told her his marriage was over, and that she had no knowledge of any plan to harm his family. Her cooperation was immediate and complete. The revelation of the affair gave investigators a potential motive. Here was a man who had found a new romantic interest, who was entangled in a marriage he no longer wanted, and who faced the arrival of a third child that would only bind him more tightly to a life he was trying to escape. The parallels to our first story tonight, to Scott Peterson and his relationship with Amber Frey, are striking and deeply unsettling. CBI agent Tammy Lee, a veteran investigator with a sharp instinct for deception, decided it was time to get Chris Watts into an interrogation room. Chris agreed to a polygraph test, a decision that would prove catastrophic for him. He failed the test comprehensively. Confronted with the results, and with the mounting evidence that contradicted his story, Chris Watts began to crack. The interrogation that followed is one of the most studied in modern criminal psychology. Agent Lee and her colleague, FBI Agent Graham Coder, employed a patient, methodical approach. They presented themselves as reasonable people who simply wanted to understand what had happened. They gave Chris room to talk, to explain, to dig himself deeper into the quicksand of his own lies, and then they called in reinforcements. Chris's father, Ronnie Watts, was brought into the interrogation room. It was a calculated move. The investigators hoped that the presence of a parent would break through Chris's defenses. They were right. Sitting across from his father, Chris Watts confessed, but the confession was another lie. He told his father that Shanann had killed the girls and that he had killed Shanann in a rage. It was a story designed to make him look less monstrous, a desperate attempt to preserve some sliver of his self-image, even as his world collapsed around him. The police didn't believe this version any more than they believed his earlier claims of ignorance. But they had what they needed. Chris Watts had admitted to killing his wife. The rest would come later. On August the 15th, investigators recovered the bodies from the Weld County oil site. Shanann was found in the shallow grave, wrapped in a bedsheet that matched pillowcases and a top sheet found in the trash at the Watts home. Bella and Celeste were found inside the oil tanks, submerged in crude oil, their small bodies pulled from the darkness of those metal cylinders in a recovery operation that would haunt the participating officers for the rest of their lives. Chris Watts was arrested that same day. The man who had stood on his front porch just 48 hours earlier, looking into television cameras and pleading for his family's safe return, was now in handcuffs, his carefully constructed world in ruins around him. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count for each of his family members. Additional charges included the unlawful termination of a pregnancy for baby Nico, who died with his mother, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. The news broke across Colorado and then across the nation like a thunderclap. The image was almost impossible to process. This clean-cut, soft-spoken man, this devoted father who appeared in dozens of smiling family photographs, had murdered his pregnant wife and then driven his 2 living daughters to a remote oil field and killed them there, one at a time, before disposing of their bodies in industrial storage tanks. The scale of the betrayal, the depth of the deception, the sheer incomprehensible cruelty of the act, it defied understanding. In Frederick, neighbors stood on their lawns and shook their heads. They had seen Chris mowing his lawn just days before. They had waved to him. They had watched his girls play in the front yard. The horror was not distant or abstract. It was next door. It was across the street. It was in the house, with the flag out front and the basketball hoop in the driveway. On November the 6th, 2018, Chris Watts stood in a Weld County courtroom and pleaded guilty to all 9 charges against him. The plea deal, negotiated between his attorneys and the Weld County District Attorney, removed the death penalty from consideration. Shanann's family had told prosecutors that they did not want to pursue execution, a decision born not of mercy for Chris, but of a desire to avoid the decades of appeals and uncertainty that death penalty cases inevitably bring. The sentencing hearing, held on November the 19th, was one of the most emotionally devastating courtroom proceedings in recent memory. Shanann's father, Frank Rizuchek, wept openly as the charges were read. Her mother, Sandra, and her brother, Frankie, delivered victim impact statements that left the courtroom in stunned silence. The judge, Marcelo Coptow, sentenced Chris Watts to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, 3 of them to be served consecutively. As he pronounced the sentence, The judge called the crimes the most inhumane and vicious he had ever encountered in his career. Prosecutors revealed new details at the hearing that chilled everyone present. They described how Bella had fought back as she was being smothered, how the 4-year-old had struggled against her father's hands. They described the oil tanks, the 8-inch openings, the unimaginable act of forcing a child's body through an opening barely large enough to accommodate it. Chris Watts showed little visible emotion throughout the proceedings. He kept his head down, his eyes on the table. Whatever internal landscape existed behind that blank exterior remained hidden, as it had been hidden throughout his life. Behind the smile, behind the Instagram posts, behind the carefully constructed image of a man who loved his family more than anything in the world. In December of 2018, Chris Watts was transferred from the Colorado prison system to a maximum security facility in Wisconsin for his own safety. Fellow inmates, even those convicted of terrible crimes themselves, tend to have a particular contempt for men who murder their children. In February of 2019, Colorado investigators traveled to Wisconsin for a final interview with Watts, a 5-hour conversation in which he provided, for the first time, a more complete account of what had happened. He admitted to killing both daughters. He described the 45-minute drive to the oil site with his dead wife in the back seat and his living children beside her. He described the girls asking what was wrong with their mother. He described the moments before he took their lives. He described Bella saying, "Daddy, no," as he pressed the blanket over her face. The details of that confession are difficult to hear, and I will not dwell on them further here. But I mention them because they matter. They matter because they transform this case from an abstraction into a reality, from a headline into a human experience of almost unbearable suffering. These were not characters in a story. They were people. Bella liked to draw pictures and hand them to anyone who would take them. Cece loved to dance and would spin in circles until she fell down laughing. Shanann dreamed of a future where her family was whole and happy and together. Nico would have had his father's quiet nature and his mother's determination. Shanann Watts was 34 years old. Bella was 4. Cece was 3. Nico never drew his first breath. What makes the Watts case so deeply unsettling? What separates it from the catalog of domestic violence cases that tragically fill our court dockets year after year is not just the brutality of the crimes, but the absolute ordinariness of the man who committed them. Chris Watts was not a criminal mastermind. He was not visibly disturbed. He did not have a history of violence or a criminal record. He was not the kind of person you would cross the street to avoid or lock your doors against. He was a quiet man with a pleasant smile who worked at an oil company and went to the gym and posted photos of his daughters eating ice cream on a sunny afternoon. He was the neighbor who waved from across the fence, the coworker who said good morning with genuine warmth, the husband who appeared in his wife's videos with an easy, uncomplicated affection that millions of people watched and admired and believed. And that is what haunts us about this case. Not the monster lurking in the shadows, not the stranger with wild eyes in a darkened alley, but the one sitting across from you at the dinner table, helping your daughter cut her pancakes, kissing you goodnight, smiling as he passes the salt. and planning in some lightless chamber of his mind to take it all away. No, the Watts house at 2825 Saratoga Trail still stands. After the murders, it sat empty for years, a place that neighbors avoided looking at directly, as if the horror of what had happened inside might somehow be visible in the brick and the siding and the neatly trimmed lawn. The house was eventually sold at auction at a steep discount to a buyer who has never been publicly identified. Shanann's family continues to endure the aftermath. They have faced not only the grief of their loss, but the cruelty of internet trolls who have, bizarrely, sought to blame Shanann for her own murder, picking apart her social media posts for evidence of marital problems, as if a troubled marriage could ever justify what was done to her and her children. If you are listening and you recognize something in this story, if you know someone who seems to be pulling away, who seems to be constructing a new identity, who treats their family as an obstacle rather than a foundation, please pay attention. Trust your instincts. Sometimes the warning signs are there, written in a language so quiet that only those paying very close attention can read it. Take a deep breath now. Let the weight of this story settle, and then let it go. We carry these stories not as burdens, but as lanterns illuminating the darkness so that others might find their way through it safely. When we return, we'll travel east to the tree-lined streets of Durham, North Carolina, where a novelist, a successful executive, and a staircase at the center of a 20-year mystery await us. But first, rest for a moment. Feel the softness beneath you. Notice the quiet, and when you're ready, we'll continue. Story 3, Death on the Staircase. Kathleen and Michael Peterson. Story 3, The Staircase. Welcome back, gentle listener. If you've been drifting in and out, that's perfectly all right. Let the words find you where you are. There's no test at the end of this, no quiz to pass. Just stories told in the dark, meant to carry you softly toward sleep. Our third story tonight takes us to the American South, to a city that wears its history like a well-tailored suit, Durham, North Carolina. If you've never been to Durham, let me paint it for you. Picture a city of rolling hills covered in towering, longleaf pines and ancient oaks draped in Spanish moss. The streets of the older neighborhoods are canopied by trees so massive and so old that their branches meet overhead, creating green tunnels that filter the Carolina sunlight into something soft and golden, like light through stained glass. Durham was once a tobacco town, its economy built on the fragrant brown leaf that grows so well in the red clay soil of the Piedmont region. The old tobacco warehouses still stand downtown, many of them converted now into restaurants, breweries, and tech startups. The new economy rising from the bones of the old. Duke University sits at the city's western edge, its Gothic Revival campus lending an air of intellectual gravitas to a place that has always been a little grittier, a little more complicated, a little less polished than its neighbor Chapel Hill, just 10 miles to the west. But it's not the university or the downtown that concerns us tonight. Our story unfolds in Forest Hills, one of Durham's most affluent neighborhoods. Forest Hills is the kind of place where the houses are hidden behind walls of boxwood and magnolia, where the driveways are long and winding, where the lots are measured in acres rather than square feet. The homes here are stately, brick colonials, sprawling ranches, the occasional Mediterranean revival with terracotta tiles and iron balconies. Money lives in Forest Hills, and it lives quietly. At 1710, Cedar Street stood one of these grand homes, a large, elegant house surrounded by mature trees, with a swimming pool in the back and rooms enough for a large blended family. This was the home of Michael and Kathleen Peterson, and on a December evening in 2001, it became the setting for one of the most debated and enduring mysteries in American criminal history. Michael Ivor Peterson was born on October the 23rd, 1943. He was, by any measure, a man who had lived a large and varied life. A Marine Corps veteran who served in Vietnam, Peterson returned from the war and reinvented himself as a novelist, writing books set against the backdrop of the conflict that had shaped his youth. His novels, The Immortal Dragon, A Time of War, A Bitter Peace, drew on his military experience and earned him a modest literary reputation, but Peterson's ambitions extended beyond fiction. He wrote a newspaper column for the Durham Herald-Sun, where his sharp pen and willingness to criticize the local officials, including the Durham County District Attorney, James Hardin Jr., made him a polarizing figure in the community. He even ran for mayor of Durham, though the campaign was unsuccessful. Peterson was the kind of man who occupied space in a room, who had opinions and wasn't afraid to share them, who could be charming one moment and abrasive the next. His personal life had been equally eventful. His first marriage to Patricia produced two sons, Clayton and Todd. While the family was stationed in Germany, a legacy of Peterson's military career, they befriended George and Elizabeth Ratliff, an American couple living nearby. When George died, the Peterson and Ratliff families grew even closer. Michael became a frequent presence in Elizabeth's home, helping with her two young daughters, Margaret and Martha. And then, in November of 1985, Elizabeth Ratliff was found dead at the bottom of a staircase in her home. She was 43 years old. German and American military authorities investigated and concluded that she had died of a cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke that had caused her to collapse and fall. Michael Peterson had been the last person to see her alive, having been at her home the evening before to help put the children to bed. After Elizabeth's death, Michael became the legal guardian of her two daughters. He raised Margaret and Martha alongside his own sons, and after his divorce from Patricia, he moved the blended family to Durham, North Carolina. It was there, in 1989, that Michael met Kathleen Atwater. Kathleen was everything Michael was not: disciplined, corporate, methodical. She worked as an executive at Nortel Networks, one of the major telecommunications companies of the era, and she was extraordinarily successful. Her salary and bonuses provided the financial foundation for the Peterson household, funding the house on Cedar Street, the private schools, the comfortable lifestyle that the family enjoyed. They married in 1997, and Kathleen's daughter, Caitlin, became the fifth child in the household. By all accounts, the blended family functioned remarkably well. The five children, Clayton, Todd, Margaret, Martha, and Caitlin, grew close, sharing meals and holidays and the ordinary intimacies of family life. Friends who visited the Peterson home described it as warm and welcoming, full of books and conversation and laughter. Michael and Kathleen seemed genuinely happy. They entertained frequently, hosting dinner parties, where Michael held court with stories and opinions, while Kathleen moved gracefully through the evening, ensuring everyone had a full glass and a comfortable seat. They were the kind of couple that other couples envied, intellectually matched, socially engaged, seemingly devoted to one another. But no marriage is entirely what it appears from the outside, and the Peterson marriage harbored secrets that would surface with devastating force in the months and years to come. The evening of Saturday, December the 8th, 2001, was unremarkable in its beginnings. Michael and Kathleen spent a quiet evening at home. They watched a movie, America's Sweethearts, a light-hearted romantic comedy starring Julia Roberts, and shared a bottle of wine by the pool. The night was cool, but not cold, typical of early December in the Piedmont, when the leaves have fallen and the air carries the first hints of winter, but the biting cold of January and February has not yet arrived. According to Michael, Kathleen headed inside around 11 o'clock, perhaps midnight. She had an early conference call the next morning for work and wanted to get some rest. Michael said he stayed outside by the pool, enjoying the quiet of the night, perhaps smoking his pipe, perhaps lost in thought. He claimed to have remained outside for an hour or two, alone with the stars and the soft sounds of a southern night, the distant hum of traffic on the interstate, the occasional call of a screech owl, the whisper of wind through the bare branches of the oak trees. At approximately 2:40 in the morning on December the 9th, Michael Peterson called 911. His voice on the recording was frantic, panicked, barely coherent. The words came in bursts, as if he were trying to communicate through a wall of shock and disbelief. He told the dispatcher that he had come inside to find his wife at the bottom of a back staircase. She was unconscious. There was blood. So much blood. "My wife had an accident," he said, his words tumbling over each other in a rush of panic. "She's still breathing. She fell down the stairs. She's still breathing. Please come." He called again moments later. This time, his voice had changed. The panic had deepened into something closer to despair. "She's not breathing," he said. "Please, she's not breathing." When paramedics arrived at 1710 Cedar Street, pushing through the front door with their equipment and their training and their years of experience with trauma, they found a scene that stopped them in their tracks. It was a scene that was difficult to reconcile with a simple fall down a set of stairs. Kathleen Peterson lay at the base of a narrow back staircase, surrounded by an extraordinary amount of blood. The walls were spattered with it. The floor was pooled with it. Her hair was matted and dark with it. She had 7 deep lacerations on the back of her head. 7 distinct wounds, each one a gash that exposed the bone of her skull. Kathleen was 48 years old. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Michael Peterson was found nearby, distraught, covered in his wife's blood, alternating between sobbing and speaking incoherently. "That was the worst," he would later say, his voice breaking. "I mean, that was worse than anything in war." The question that would consume Durham, and eventually the nation, was deceptively simple. Did Kathleen Peterson fall down the stairs, or was she pushed? Was her death a tragic accident, or was it murder? The autopsy, performed by the North Carolina Chief Medical Examiner, concluded that Kathleen had been beaten to death. The 7 lacerations on her head, the medical examiner argued, were inconsistent with a fall and consistent with repeated blows from a blunt instrument. The amount of blood, the sheer, staggering volume of it, covering the walls and floor of the staircase, suggested a prolonged event, not a sudden collapse. Michael Peterson was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He was indicted on December the 20th, 2001, just 11 days after Kathleen's death. He posted a $2 million bond and was released to await trial, proclaiming his innocence to anyone who would listen. The trial, which began in July of 2003, was one of the longest in North Carolina history, stretching over nearly 5 months. It became a spectacle that attracted national attention and, unusually, a French documentary film crew. Director Jean-Xavier de Lestrade had approached the Peterson defense team shortly after the indictment and been granted extraordinary access, not just to strategy meetings and private conversations, but to the emotional interior of a family in crisis. His cameras captured every twist and turn of the proceedings in what would become the acclaimed documentary series, The Staircase, a work that would itself generate controversy, acclaim, and an entire subcategory of true crime obsession. The courtroom in Durham became a theater where two radically different narratives competed for the jury's belief. The prosecution called witness after witness, building their case brick by methodical brick. The defense countered with experts and alternative theories, trying to plant seeds of reasonable doubt in the minds of 12 citizens who held a man's life in their hands. The prosecution's case was built on several pillars. First, the physical evidence, the blood spatter patterns, the severity of Kathleen's injuries, and the medical examiner's conclusion that the wounds were inflicted, not accidental. Second, the motive. Prosecutors alleged that Michael had killed Kathleen to collect on a $1.4 million life insurance policy and to prevent her from discovering a secret that would have destroyed their marriage. That secret emerged during the investigation when police examined Michael's computer. They found a history of visits to websites featuring male escorts, as well as email exchanges with men in which Michael expressed sexual interest. There were photographs. There were arrangements to meet. The digital trail painted a picture of a man living a double life, the devoted husband on the surface, the seeker of anonymous encounters beneath. The prosecution argued that Kathleen had discovered Michael's bisexuality on the night of her death, perhaps by seeing something on his laptop, which was found open in the house, and that a confrontation had ensued. Imagine the scene. Kathleen heading to bed, glancing at the computer screen and seeing something that shattered everything she thought she knew about her husband and her marriage. Imagine the argument that might have followed. The accusations, the denials, the escalating fury. The prosecution suggested that this confrontation ended with Michael killing Kathleen to prevent the revelation from destroying his reputation and his carefully curated public image. The introduction of Michael's sexuality into the trial was controversial. Defense attorney David Rudolph argued that it was prejudicial and irrelevant, that a man's sexual orientation had nothing to do with whether he committed murder. But in 2003, in a Southern courtroom, the evidence of bisexuality carried a stigma that the prosecution was able to exploit. Several jurors would later admit that the computer evidence had influenced their thinking, though they insisted it was not the deciding factor. The defense, led by Rudolph, a brilliant and passionate attorney who brought both legal acumen and genuine emotional investment to his client's cause, offered a radically different interpretation. Rudolph argued that Kathleen's death was a tragic accident. He suggested that she had been drinking wine and had also taken Valium, a combination that could impair balance and judgment. She had attempted to climb the narrow back staircase, slipped and fallen, striking her head on the hard surfaces of the stairwell. The initial injury caused bleeding, and as she tried to get up, disoriented and in pain, she slipped in her own blood and fell again, sustaining additional injuries. To support this theory, the defense called Dr. Henry Lee, one of the most famous forensic scientists in the world. Lee testified that the amount of blood was not necessarily indicative of a prolonged attack, that head wounds bleed profusely, and that blood spatter patterns consistent with the prosecution's theory could also be produced by coughing. In a memorable courtroom demonstration, Lee drank ketchup and then spit it out, producing a spray pattern that he argued resembled the blood evidence at the scene. The prosecution also introduced the death of Elizabeth Ratliff in Germany 16 years earlier. The parallels were chilling. Another woman found at the bottom of a staircase, another woman in Michael Peterson's life, another death attributed initially to natural causes, 2 staircases, 2 women, 2 deaths, and 1 man, the last person to see both women alive. Prosecutors argued that the similarity was too great to be coincidental, that lightning does not strike twice in exactly the same way, unless there is a common conductor. They arranged for Ratliff's body to be exhumed from her grave in Texas and transported to North Carolina, where the same medical examiner who had performed Kathleen's autopsy conducted a new examination. His conclusion: Elizabeth Ratliff had not died of a stroke, as the German authorities had determined. She, too, had been murdered. The exhumation and re-examination were dramatic pieces of courtroom theater, the kind of evidence that lodges in a jury's memory and refuses to leave. The defense objected strenuously, arguing that the evidence was prejudicial and that the original German investigation had been thorough and accurate. The German authorities, they pointed out, had found no evidence of foul play. The military had conducted its own investigation and reached the same conclusion. For 16 years, Elizabeth Ratliff's death had been a medical tragedy, not a crime. To overturn that finding now, based on a second autopsy performed under very different circumstances, seemed to the defense like a desperate reach by prosecutors who were building a narrative rather than following the evidence. But the judge allowed it, and the jury heard about 2 women, 2 staircases, 2 deaths, and 1 man who was present for both. It was, perhaps, the most damaging moment of the entire trial. On October the 10th, 2003, after 14 days of deliberation, 14 days in which the jury requested to review evidence multiple times, in which notes were sent to the judge, in which the tension in the courthouse corridors became almost physically oppressive, the verdict was read. Michael Peterson was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Kathleen Peterson. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The jurors later told the documentary crew what had swayed them. It was the blood, the sheer staggering amount of blood. They could not reconcile the volume of it, the distribution of it, the way it coated the walls and pooled on the floor, with a simple fall. A fall might produce blood, yes, but not this much. Not like this. This, they believed, was something else entirely. This was violence. The verdict devastated the Peterson family. Michael's children, biological and adopted alike, had stood by him throughout the trial, sitting in the courtroom every day, their faces drawn with tension and fear. They were convinced of his innocence, and the guilty verdict landed on them like a physical blow. Clayton, Todd, Margaret, and Martha, the four who had defended their father, wept and embraced each other in the hallway outside the courtroom. Kathleen's daughter, Caitlin, who had initially supported her stepfather, had changed her position months earlier after reading the full autopsy report in detail. The document had transformed her understanding of her mother's death. The injuries she read about were not the injuries of a woman who had slipped on a staircase. They were the injuries of a woman who had been attacked. Caitlin reached out to Margaret, her stepsister, to share her concerns. "You need to read this," she said. "You need to understand that Mom did not die from falling down the stairs." But Margaret and Martha remained staunchly in their father's corner. The conversation ended the relationship between the stepsisters. The once tight-knit blended family was torn apart, the fault lines of the case splitting through the middle of bonds that had taken a decade to build. Holidays would be spent separately. Phone calls would go unanswered. The family that Michael and Kathleen had so carefully constructed lay in ruins, another casualty of whatever had happened on that staircase. Michael Peterson began serving his sentence, and for 8 years the case seemed closed. But beneath the surface, forces were at work that would eventually blow it wide open again. The first crack came from the prosecution's own witness. Dwayne Deaver, the state blood spatter analyst, whose testimony had been central to the guilty verdict, was found to have falsified evidence in dozens of cases. An independent audit of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation's Blood Analysis Unit revealed a pattern of distorted and fabricated results, and Deaver was at the center of it. He was eventually fired and faced criminal charges for obstruction of justice. In December of 2011, Judge Orlando Hudson, the same judge who had presided over the original trial, vacated Peterson's conviction. He ruled that Deaver's testimony had been materially misleading and deliberately false, and that Peterson's right to a fair trial had been compromised. After 8 years behind bars, Michael Peterson was released on bail and placed under house arrest. The legal maneuvering continued for years. A new trial was scheduled, postponed, rescheduled, and then, in another twist that no novelist could have invented, a new theory of Kathleen's death emerged, one so strange, so improbable, so perfectly bizarre that it seemed to belong in fiction rather than reality. The owl theory. It began with Michael's neighbor and friend, Larry Pollard, an attorney and avid hunter. While reviewing the evidence, Pollard noticed something in an SBI crime lab report, a single microscopic feather found on Kathleen's body. He also identified what appeared to be additional feathers in hair found clutched in Kathleen's left hand. And when he looked at photographs of Kathleen's head wounds, he saw something that others had missed. The lacerations came in pairs, spaced in a pattern that was remarkably consistent with the talons of a barred owl, a large bird of prey common in the forests of North Carolina. Pollard's theory went like this. On the night of her death, Kathleen had gone outside, perhaps to check on some holiday decorations she had set up earlier. While standing beneath a tree in the front yard, she was attacked by a barred owl that mistook her hair for prey. Owl attacks on humans, while rare, are documented. Barred owls in particular have been known to strike people who venture too close to their nests, and their talons are sharp enough to slice through skin and scalp with ease. The theory explained details that neither the prosecution nor the defense had fully accounted for. The blood drops found on the front walkway, the blood smear on the front door, the lacerations that didn't quite match any known blunt instrument. It suggested that Kathleen, bleeding and disoriented from the owl attack, had stumbled back into the house, made it to the staircase, and collapsed, whereupon she lost consciousness, slipped in her own blood, and sustained the additional injuries that ultimately killed her. The owl theory drew both serious attention and considerable ridicule. Wildlife experts from the University of Minnesota and from a raptor rehabilitation center in Montana examined the evidence and concluded that the wounds were consistent with an owl attack. The Durham District Attorney's Office was less convinced, and no new trial resulted from the theory alone. The case finally reached its conclusion, or what passes for a conclusion in a story with no satisfying ending. On February the 24th, 2017, 15 years and 2 months had passed since Kathleen Peterson's death. In that time, Michael Peterson had been convicted, imprisoned for 8 years, released, placed under house arrest, and subjected to an endless carousel of hearings, motions, and legal arguments that had consumed the resources and attention of everyone involved. Facing a new trial and weary of the legal battle that had devoured his 60s and was now consuming his 70s, Michael Peterson entered an offered plea to the reduced charge of voluntary manslaughter. An offered plea is an unusual and somewhat paradoxical legal device, one that exists in that gray space between guilt and innocence, where the American legal system sometimes finds itself trapped. It allows a defendant to plead guilty while simultaneously maintaining their innocence. In essence, Peterson was saying, "I did not kill my wife. I believe I am innocent, but I acknowledge that the state probably has enough evidence to convince a jury otherwise, and after 15 years, I am simply unwilling to roll the dice again. I want this to be over." His defense attorney, David Rudolph, who had fought for Peterson with unwavering conviction for a decade and a half, stood beside his client and explained the decision. Peterson, he said, did not believe he could receive a fair trial. The tainted evidence, the compromised witnesses, the years of media coverage, all of it had poisoned the well too thoroughly, and there was the simple human exhaustion of it. Peterson was 73 years old. He had lost his wife, his freedom, his reputation, and much of his family. He had nothing left to give to the legal system. Judge Orlando Hudson sentenced Peterson to 64 to 86 months in prison. Since Peterson had already served more than 98 months, the 8 years before his conviction was overturned, he did not face any additional prison time. He walked out of the courtroom a free man, though a convicted one. Kathleen's sister, Candace Zamperini was present for the hearing. Her reaction was fierce and immediate. She addressed Peterson directly, her voice sharp with years of accumulated grief and anger. The plea, she said, changed nothing. Michael Peterson had pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. He would carry that conviction for the rest of his life. For Candace, for Kathleen's family, that was enough. Not justice, perhaps, but something adjacent to it. Peterson himself spoke to reporters outside the courthouse. He looked tired, older, diminished. Man who had been ground down by 15 years of legal warfare. He said that taking the plea was the most difficult decision of his life. He maintained his innocence, as he always had, but he accepted the reality of his situation with a weary pragmatism. His son had told him, he said, "You'll never win. Pick up your chips and go home." As of today, Michael Peterson lives alone in a ground floor apartment in Durham, North Carolina. His defense attorney has noted with pointed irony that the apartment has no stairs. He has published 2 books telling his side of the story, Behind the Staircase and Beyond the Staircase, with proceeds going to charity and reportedly toward the $25 million wrongful death settlement awarded to Kathleen's daughter, Caitlin. He is 82 years old now. The question of what happened on that staircase on the night of December the 8th, 2001, remains officially unresolved. The offered plea ensures that it will likely stay that way. Michael Peterson will never be fully exonerated, and he will never be definitively convicted. The truth, whatever it is, lies somewhere in the space between a man's sworn testimony, a medical examiner's report, an owl's talons, and the silent, blood-soaked walls of a staircase that has nothing left to tell. Kathleen Hunt. Peterson was 48 years old. She was a brilliant executive, a devoted mother, and by all accounts, a woman who deserved far more years than she was given. Whatever happened that night, murder or accident, malice or terrible misfortune, she deserved better than to die alone on a cold staircase in the small hours of the morning, with no one to hear her fall. Let that thought settle as we prepare for our final story tonight. Breathe slowly. Feel the heaviness in your eyelids. Notice the comfort of the pillow beneath your head. The night is growing deeper now, and we have one more journey to make. Our final story takes us back to Colorado, to the mountain towns that sit high above the plains, where the air is thin and the valleys are wide, and the silence of the wilderness presses close against the edges of civilization. It is the story of a woman who vanished on Mother's Day, and the long, winding road toward justice that followed. But first, rest. Just for a moment. Let the quiet find you. Story 4, Vanished on Mother's Day. Suzanne Morphew. Story 4, Suzanne Morphew. And so we come to our final story of the evening. By now, you may be deep in that warm, heavy place between waking and sleep, where the words drift over you like clouds passing across a moonlit sky. That's exactly where you should be. Let the story find you. Let it settle around you like a blanket. There's no need to hold on to every detail. Just listen and let go. Our last journey tonight takes us high into the mountains of Colorado, far from the suburban plains where Chris Watts lived, far from the cities and the interstates and the noise of modern life. We are going to Chaffee County, a place of breathtaking beauty nestled in the heart of the Rocky Mountains, about 100 miles west of Colorado Springs. If you have never seen this part of Colorado, let me try to give you a sense of it. Imagine a wide valley, the Upper Arkansas Valley, cradled between two massive mountain ranges. To the west rise the Collegiate Peaks, a line of 14,000-foot summits named for the great universities of the East: Mount Harvard, Mount Yale, Mount Princeton, Mount Columbia, their flanks streaked with snow even in midsummer. To the east, the Sawatch Range presents a wall of granite and forest that catches the morning sun and turns it to gold. The town of Salida sits near the center of this valley, a former railroad hub that has reinvented itself as an outdoor recreation destination. Whitewater rafters come for the Arkansas River, which churns through a granite canyon nearby. Hikers and mountain bikers come for the hundreds of miles of trails that wind through the surrounding mountains. Skiers come for Monarch Mountain, a modest but beloved ski area just 20 miles to the west. The air here is thin and clean, scented with pine and sage, and the silence, the profound, enveloping silence of high mountain wilderness, is one of those things that changes you once you experience it. It was in this landscape, on a property along Puma Path near the small community of Maysville, that Barry and Suzanne Morphew had built their Colorado life. The property sat at roughly 8,000 feet of elevation, surrounded by national forest land, with views that stretched for miles across the valley. It was the kind of place that people dream about when they dream about escaping. Remote, beautiful, quiet, far from the complications of the lowland world. Suzanne Morphew was born on September the 20th, 1970, in Alexandria, Indiana. She was a small-town Midwestern girl who grew up with the values of that part of the country: community, family, hard work, faith. She met Barry Morphew when they were both living in Indiana, and they married and started a family. Barry ran a landscaping and construction business, and he was good at it. Hardworking, physically capable, kind of man who could build a deck, or grade a driveway, or install a sprinkler system with equal competence. The couple had 2 daughters, Mallory and Macy, and when the girls were still young, the Morphews decided to make a dramatic change. They sold their Indiana property and moved to Colorado, drawn by the mountains and the lifestyle and the promise of something bigger and more beautiful than the flat fields of the Midwest. They purchased the property on Puma Path and settled into a life that, from the outside, looked like a mountain paradise. Suzanne threw herself into her new community with the same energy she brought to everything. She made friends, she volunteered, she hiked the local trails, and fell in love with the landscape the way transplants often do, with the fervor and appreciation of someone who has seen something extraordinary for the first time and cannot quite believe their luck. Photographs from this period show a woman who seemed genuinely happy, smiling in the mountain sunshine, posing with her daughters, standing on a ridgeline with the world spread out below her. But all was not well in the Morphew household. Like so many of the marriages we have explored tonight, the one between Barry and Suzanne contained tensions and fractures that were invisible to the outside world, but painfully real to those within. Friends would later reveal that Suzanne had confided her unhappiness. The marriage, she told them, was strained. She felt isolated. She felt controlled. She had even begun to talk about divorce, testing the word carefully, the way you might test the ice on a frozen lake, gingerly, aware that what lies beneath could swallow you whole. In early May of 2020, just days before she vanished, Suzanne sent Barry a text message that would later become a crucial piece of evidence. The message was blunt, direct, stripped of the diplomatic language that unhappy spouses often use to soften the blow. "I'm done," she wrote. "I could care less what you're up to, and have been for years. We just need to figure this out civilly." Those words, "I'm done," landed with the finality of a door closing. But whether they reached Barry as a relief or a threat, as a liberation or a provocation, would become one of the central questions of the investigation that followed. There was another complication. Suzanne had been having an affair. The relationship had been going on for some time, conducted in secret, hidden from Barry and from most of the people in their lives. It was, perhaps, the act of a woman who had already emotionally left her marriage and was seeking connection and comfort elsewhere while she gathered the courage to leave physically as well. Mother's Day 2020, May the 10th. The date carries a particular weight in this story, a cruel irony that makes the events that followed even harder to bear. Mother's Day, the day set aside to celebrate the women who give us life, who nurture us, who hold us when we are afraid, became, for the Morphew family, the day that everything was taken away. The world in May of 2020 was already strange and unsettling. The COVID-19 pandemic had swept across the globe, and Colorado, like everywhere else, was under lockdown restrictions. People were staying home, working remotely, homeschooling their children. The mountain towns of Chaffee County, normally bustling with tourists and outdoor enthusiasts by mid-May, were quieter than usual. The trails were emptier. The streets were stiller. It was a strange time to go missing, a time when everyone was supposed to be home. Mallory and Macy, the Morphew's two daughters, were not at the house that weekend. They were away on a pre-planned trip, a detail that investigators would later note with interest, as it meant that Barry and Suzanne were alone at the property during the window of time in which Suzanne disappeared. According to Barry Morphew, he woke early that morning, around 5 a.m., to drive to Broomfield, a suburb of Denver, roughly 3 hours away, for a landscaping job. He told investigators that Suzanne was still asleep when he left, and that he did not wake her. It was the last time, he said, that he saw his wife alive. Investigators would later determine that Suzanne had taken a selfie on the afternoon of May the 9th, the day before she disappeared. It is the last photograph of her, alive, captured on her phone in the mountain light. Her face relaxed, her expression unreadable. Was she a woman enjoying a quiet Saturday afternoon? Was she a woman gathering her courage for a difficult conversation? Was she a woman who sensed, on some level beneath conscious thought, that something was about to go terribly wrong? The photograph gives us no answers. It is simply the last image of a woman who had hours left to live, frozen in a moment that reveals nothing and everything at the same time. Suzanne's plan for Mother's Day, as far as anyone knew, was simple. She was going to go for a bike ride. This was not unusual. She rode regularly, taking advantage of the network of dirt roads and trails that surrounded their property. The weather was beautiful, the kind of clear, bright Colorado spring day that makes you grateful to be alive and outdoors. But Suzanne never came back from that ride. At 5:46 in the evening, Suzanne's neighbor reported her missing. The neighbor had noticed that Suzanne had not been around all day, which was unusual. Calls to her phone went unanswered. Texts received no reply. The house appeared empty. When law enforcement arrived, they found Suzanne's bicycle on a hillside off a dirt road between the Morphew home and Highway 50, less than a mile from the house. The bike appeared to have been thrown or placed there, rather than abandoned by a rider who had stopped or fallen. One deputy would later testify that the positioning of the bicycle seemed staged, that it looked as though someone had deliberately placed it there to create the impression of an accident or abduction. Suzanne's helmet was found separately, about 0.8 of a mile from the bicycle. There was no blood at either location. There were no signs of a struggle. There were no witnesses. Inside the Morphew home, investigators found no signs of forced entry. Suzanne's personal belongings were in place. Her car was in the garage. Everything suggested that she had left the house under her own power, on her bicycle, and had simply ceased to exist somewhere between her front door and the open road. A massive search effort was launched, involving the Chaffee County Sheriff's Office, the FBI, and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. It was one of the largest search operations in the region's history, a mobilization of resources that reflected both the seriousness of the disappearance and the difficulty of searching terrain that is, by its very nature, vast, rugged, and unforgiving. Helicopters flew grid patterns over the mountains, their rotors echoing off the granite walls of the surrounding peaks. Search and rescue teams, men and women who volunteer their time and risk their safety to help strangers, combed the forests and canyons on foot, calling Suzanne's name into the thin mountain air. Divers explored the waters of the Arkansas River, probing the cold, churning currents for any trace of the missing woman. Dogs trained to detect human remains were deployed across hundreds of square miles of wilderness, their handlers following them through dense stands of pine and aspen, across rocky ridgelines, along the banks of mountain streams. They found nothing. Day after day, week after week, the searches continued, and day after day, they returned empty-handed. The mountains, which had always been Suzanne's sanctuary, her place of peace and beauty and solitude, kept their secrets. The community of Salida and the surrounding area rallied around the search. Flyers bearing Suzanne's photograph appeared in shop windows and on community bulletin boards. Friends organized candlelight vigils and awareness campaigns. The mountain community, tight-knit and protective, refused to let the case go quiet, even as the weeks turned to months, and the hope of finding Suzanne alive began to fade like the last light of a mountain sunset. Barry Morphew, meanwhile, presented himself to the world as a devastated husband. He appeared on Good Morning America, his eyes red, his voice thick with emotion, and pleaded for information about his wife's whereabouts. He offered a $100,000 reward for her safe return. He shared old love notes that Suzanne had written him, holding them up for the cameras as evidence of a happy marriage. When asked directly if he was involved in his wife's disappearance, he was emphatic. "Absolutely not," he said. "We had a wonderful life, a wonderful marriage. She was just so loving and giving, and such a good mother. But investigators were already looking at Barry Morphew with the careful, measured skepticism that experienced detectives bring to cases where a spouse disappears. His story contained inconsistencies. He said he was at a job site in Broomfield when he got the call that Suzanne was missing, but surveillance footage and cell tower data suggested he was actually at a hotel in Broomfield, not at the job site at all. An employee who was supposed to travel with him to the job said that Morphew had not shown up as planned. More troubling still, investigators discovered that on the day Suzanne disappeared, Barry had made 5 separate trash runs, 5 trips to different locations to dispose of items in various trash cans. This was unusual behavior for anyone, but for a man whose wife would be reported missing that same evening, it was deeply suspicious. And then there was the matter of the ballot. In November of 2020, 6 months after Suzanne's disappearance, election officials in Chaffee County discovered that someone had submitted an absentee ballot in Suzanne Morphew's name for the presidential election. The ballot had been filled out and mailed by Barry Morphew. When confronted, Barry offered an explanation that was remarkable in its brazenness. He said he did it because he wanted Trump to win, and he figured all these other guys are cheating. The voter fraud charge was relatively minor in the context of what investigators suspected, but it spoke to something important about Barry Morphew's character: a willingness to appropriate his missing wife's identity, to use her name and her citizenship for his own purposes, as if she were already gone and her existence was now simply a resource to be exploited. Nearly 1 year after Suzanne vanished, on May the 5th, 2021, Barry Morphew was arrested and charged with first-degree murder after deliberation, tampering with physical evidence, and attempting to influence a public servant. The last charge stemmed from allegations that he had provided false information to investigators to conceal the crime. The arrest came before Suzanne's body had been found, a risky prosecutorial strategy, but one that the 11th Judicial District Attorney, Linda Stanley, believed was justified by the weight of circumstantial evidence. The case against Barry was complex and largely built on inference. The troubled marriage, the text messages, the inconsistencies in his timeline, the trash runs, the staged bicycle, and a web of financial and behavioral evidence that pointed toward guilt. But the case would soon descend into chaos. District Attorney Linda Stanley became a frequent guest on true crime shows and podcasts, discussing the case in ways that defense attorneys argued were prejudicial and improper. She made statements to the media that went far beyond what was appropriate for a sitting prosecutor. Complaints were filed with the Colorado Supreme Court, and an investigation into Stanley's conduct began in April of 2022, with the trial just days away and the prosecution's case increasingly imperiled by Stanley's misconduct. The charges against Barry Morphew were dropped. The decision was made without prejudice, meaning the charges could be refiled. But for Barry Morphew, it was a victory. He walked out of the courthouse a free man, and the case appeared to be slipping away. Linda Stanley would eventually be disbarred, her law license revoked by the state for her conduct in the Morphew case and other matters. It was a stunning fall for a prosecutor who had promised justice for Suzanne Morphew and instead delivered a cautionary tale about the dangers of ego and ambition in the pursuit of that justice. But the story was far from over. The investigators, the FBI agents, the CBI officers, the Chaffee County detectives who had worked this case from the beginning never stopped. They continued to search. They continued to analyze evidence. They continued to believe that Suzanne Morphew was out there somewhere, waiting to be found. And in September of 2023, more than 3 years after Suzanne's disappearance, they found her. The discovery came in the most unexpected of ways. Investigators from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation were searching an area near the town of Moffett in Saguache County, not specifically for Suzanne, but in connection with a different, unrelated investigation. Moffett is a tiny, unincorporated community in the San Luis Valley, about 40 miles south of the Morphew home. It is the kind of place that most Coloradans have never heard of. A handful of buildings at a crossroads, surrounded by mile after mile of high desert scrubland, with the Great Sand Dunes National Park visible in the distance, and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rising like a wall to the east. It was here, on this remote and lonely stretch of land, that investigators discovered human remains in a shallow grave. The grave had been dug in the sandy, alkaline soil of the valley floor, in a place where the nearest neighbor was miles away, and the only regular visitors were antelope, coyotes, and the occasional rancher checking fence lines. It was the kind of place you would choose if you wanted to hide something or someone and never have it found. DNA testing confirmed what the investigators had long suspected but could not prove. The remains were those of Suzanne Morphew. She had been there for over 3 years, buried in the high desert soil beneath the enormous Colorado sky, in a place so remote that most people would never have reason to visit it. The landscape around the grave was stark and beautiful in the way that only the high desert can be. Sagebrush and rabbit brush stretching to the horizon, the mountains rising on every side, the silence broken only by wind and the occasional cry of a red-tailed hawk circling on the thermals. For Suzanne's friends, for the community that had searched and hoped and prayed, the discovery was both devastating and, in a terrible way, a relief. The uncertainty was over. The questions about whether she might still be alive somewhere, might have simply walked away from her life, could finally be laid to rest. Suzanne Morphew was dead. She had been dead, almost certainly, since the day she disappeared. The autopsy that followed produced a finding that would transform the case entirely. The coroner ruled Suzanne's death a homicide, and in her remains, specifically in her bone marrow, which had been preserved by the dry, alkaline conditions of the burial site, investigators found traces of a chemical cocktail known as BAM, butorphanol, azapirone, and metatomidine. These are not household chemicals. They are not the kind of substances that one encounters in daily life or picks up at a pharmacy. BAM is a powerful animal tranquilizer, a precisely formulated mixture used primarily by wildlife professionals to sedate large animals, deer, elk, bears, for tagging, relocation, or medical treatment. In humans, the effects of BAM would be devastating: rapid sedation, loss of consciousness, respiratory depression, and potentially death. Before Suzanne's death, BAM could only be obtained with a prescription from a veterinarian, and it was manufactured by only one company in the entire United States. It was not a common substance. It was not widely available. It was, in fact, exceedingly rare in the hands of anyone outside the wildlife management and veterinary communities, and Barry Morphew had access to BAM. He had admitted to using it in the past to sedate deer, a practice from his time in Indiana where he had used the tranquilizer for what he described as a wildlife management on his property. He had filled several prescriptions for the drug from an Indiana veterinarian before moving to Colorado, and investigators noted that he appeared to have stocked up on the substance before leaving the state. When investigators searched the Morphew home after Suzanne's disappearance, they found a tranquilizer gun and darts in a locked gun safe positioned near the front of the house, readily accessible, not buried in a back closet or forgotten in a storage unit. Investigators then conducted an exhaustive search of prescription records across the region. They wanted to know who else in the area had access to BAM during the time of Suzanne's disappearance. The answer was chilling in its simplicity. According to the indictment, when Suzanne Morphew disappeared, only one private citizen living in that entire area of the state had access to BAM, Barry Morphew. On June the 18th, 2025, a grand jury in the 12th Judicial District returned an indictment charging Barry Morphew with first-degree murder in the death of his wife. He was arrested in Arizona 2 days later and extradited to Colorado. This time, the prosecution was in different hands. The new district attorney, Ann Kelly, approached the case with the methodical care that her predecessor had lacked. The Boulder County District Attorney's Office was brought in to assist, and the Denver County District Attorney's Office provided appellate support. The lessons of the first failed prosecution had been learned. Barry Morphew pleaded not guilty in January of 2026. He was released on a $3 million bond, posted with the help of his daughters, who have maintained throughout this ordeal that their father is innocent. A trial has been scheduled for later this year. The case remains, as of this telling, unresolved. Barry Morphew maintains his innocence. His attorney has called the prosecution's case circumstantial and predetermined. The defense argues that the evidence of BAM in Suzanne's remains proves nothing, that the chemicals could have entered her system in other ways, that the prosecution is building a narrative rather than following the evidence. But the prosecution has something it did not have before: a body, and in that body, traces of a chemical that only one private citizen in the region was known to possess. Whether that will be enough to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt remains to be seen. What strikes me most about the Suzanne Morphew case is how it mirrors the other stories we've heard tonight, and yet how it remains distinct. Like Lacey Peterson, Suzanne vanished into thin air, leaving behind a life full of personal belongings and unanswered questions. Like Chris Watts, her husband presented a grief-stricken facade to the media, while prosecutors allege concealing the truth of what he had done. Like the Peterson staircase case, the evidence is largely circumstantial, open to interpretation, subject to the push and pull of skilled attorneys arguing before a jury. But the Suzanne Morphew case adds something new to the pattern: the element of patience. This case has unfolded over 5 years through 2 separate prosecutions, a disbarred district attorney, the discovery of remains in a remote mountain grave, and a chemical analysis that reads like something from a forensic thriller. Justice, if it comes, will have been a long time in the making. Suzanne Morphew was 49 years old when she disappeared. She was a mother of 2 daughters whom she loved fiercely. She was a woman who had moved across the country to build a new life in a place of extraordinary beauty. She hiked mountain trails and breathed mountain air and watched sunsets that painted the collegiate peaks in shades of rose and amber. She deserved to grow old in those mountains, to watch her daughters graduate and marry and have children of their own, to sit on her porch on summer evenings and listen to the river and the wind and the silence. Instead, she was buried in a shallow grave 40 miles from home, in a landscape that should have been her sanctuary but became her tomb. And so we reach the end of tonight's journey. 4 stories. 4 women whose lives were cut short by the people closest to them. 4 men whose outward appearances concealed intentions that no one could have predicted. If there is a thread that connects these stories beyond the obvious darkness, it is this. In each case, the warning signs were there. They were subtle, easy to overlook, easy to explain away. A husband who seemed a little too calm, a marriage that was crumbling behind a perfect facade, a man who was building a new life while his old one still contained people who loved him and depended on him. A pattern of lies that grew more elaborate with each telling. We tell these stories not to frighten, but to illuminate. If you recognize something in these narratives, a relationship that feels wrong, a partner whose explanations don't quite add up, a situation that makes you feel unsafe, please trust that feeling. Reach out to someone you trust. Call a helpline. Talk to a friend. You deserve to be safe, and you deserve to be believed. To the victims, to Lacey, to Shanann, to Bella, to Celeste, to Nico, to Kathleen, and to Suzanne, we remember you, not as case files or headlines or episodes of a podcast, but as the living, breathing, laughing, dreaming human beings you were. You mattered. You are not forgotten. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I hope the stories have carried you gently toward rest. If you're still awake, close your eyes now. Feel the weight of the blankets, the softness of the pillow, the quiet of the night around you. Tomorrow is a new day, full of its own light and its own possibilities. Sleep well, and I'll see you next time.